Have you ever stopped to think that some stories don't want to be explained, but still insist on calling us? Well, yes. Before we begin, I'll warn you, what I'm going to tell you today is not for the faint of heart. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, take advantage of it now to subscribe, like, and comment at the end about what you think really happened, because I promise this investigation will blow your mind. Imagine an isolated lighthouse, surrounded by a merciless sea, where every gust of wind seems to whisper ancient secrets. Now add to this an experienced guardian with a military background who disappears without a trace, leaving behind only clues that seem more like an invitation to the unexplained. It sounds like a movie script, but it's a real case that I personally investigated. What makes this story even more disturbing is that the more you try to rely on logic, the more it slips through your fingers. Official records don't add up, testimonies contradict each other, and the clues, when they exist, point to something far beyond what any criminal investigation manual can explain. It's like trying to piece together a jigsaw puzzle that keeps changing shape. And the paradox is precisely this. Perhaps what happened to Arthur Doyle on that stormy night wasn't a simple crime, but neither was it something science can stamp away. Today, I'll take you inside this investigation, but I warn you, in the end, you may not want the answers you've been searching for. I still remember the first time I saw that lighthouse. Isolated, perched on a cliff that seemed to defy the sea. It had a presence that, just looking at it, made you feel something wasn't right. The journey there wasn't easy. An old boat, the smell of salt permeating every stitch of clothing, and a fog that seemed to swallow you whole. It wasn't just the physical distance that made the place inaccessible. It was as if the very environment wanted to keep away any curious person. The island was small, practically a piece of rock lost in the ocean, and when the sea raged, it was impossible to get there or leave. I always say that places like this have a character of their own, as if they breathe and watch whoever dares to set foot on their territory. The silence was so profound that the sound of the wind seemed louder than screams. And from experience, I've learned that isolation isn't just geographic. It messes with your mind, distorts your perception, and can change the course of any investigation. With every step along the wet stone path, I felt loneliness clinging to my skin. There were no birds, no laughter, nothing, only the lighthouse, standing like an eternal guardian, watching over the turbulent waters. I'd explored distant places, but here, every detail seemed to whisper stories no one had told. The musty smell, the damp swollen wood, the strange echo, it was like entering a space outside of time. And it was precisely this extreme isolation that made me wonder, if something happened there, who could have seen it? Or worse, who could have helped? These questions, already arising as I disembarked, would lead me to discoveries I wasn't prepared to face. But that, of course, I would only discover as I delved deeper into the lighthouse's dark past. When I began combing through the lighthouse's old records, I realized that the building held more than just stories of storms and rescues. It was built in the late 19th century, at a time when the coast was plagued by shipwrecks. It was as if the merciless sea wanted to exact a toll on every vessel that dared to cross those waters. The construction, according to the yellowed newspapers, cost not only money but also lives. And this is where things start to get strange. 3 workers died during construction, all under circumstances no one could quite explain. One fell from scaffolding, another was found drowned a few meters from the beach, and the third, well, they say he simply disappeared. Authorities at the time attributed it all to workplace accidents. But the way the reports were written seemed too cautious, as if someone was trying to hide something bigger. And that wasn't all. Popular tales spoke of lights on the horizon, figures climbing the rocks, and the sound of bells coming from the sea. These rumors fueled a local legend that the lighthouse not only illuminated ships, but also guided other presences to the island. Legends? Perhaps, but as a researcher, I learned that many legends are born from uncomfortable truths. Each ancient document I found seemed to leave more questions than answers. It felt like opening a Pandora's box. The more I discovered, the more I realized that the lighthouse wasn't just a functional building, it was a stage for events beyond the ordinary. And to make matters worse, the name of the last keeper, Arthur M. Doyle, already appeared on the pages, decades before he took office. Arthur M. Doyle. A name that to many meant nothing, but to me, it sounded like a riddle waiting to be deciphered. A former naval officer, respected by his peers, and known for his almost military-like discipline. He was the kind of man unlikely to be shaken by nonsense. However, when I began to investigate his life outside the official records, I found chinks in the armor. Small stories of silent crises, episodes of isolation, and a melancholy that, according to neighbors, followed him like a shadow. Talking to those who knew him was like trying to decipher an incomplete code. Some spoke of him as a man of integrity and serenity, others as someone who kept too many secrets. I learned that in investigations, profiles like these are dangerous because we never know where the facade ends and the truth begins. What caught my attention was the fact that Arthur asked to be transferred to the Lighthouse, a lonely, storm-battered outpost, far from everything and everyone. An old friend of his, whom I met on a narrow street near the port, said Arthur had the eyes of someone who's seen things he shouldn't have. That phrase haunted me for weeks. He seemed like someone who didn't run from danger. Instead, he ran toward it. Why? Maybe to confront it, or maybe because he believed he had nothing left to lose. The truth is, this kind of behavior always points to stories deeper than any police report. The more I studied his story, the clearer it became that Arthur wasn't just a clerk doing a job. He seemed to be on a personal mission, and the lighthouse, well, maybe the lighthouse was part of the answer, or perhaps part of the problem. And it was this impression that drew me into the final days before his disappearance, days that would leave strangely uncomfortable clues. 3 days before his disappearance, Arthur sent a radio transmission that, to this day, sends chills down the spines of listeners. His voice was lower than usual, as if he wanted to prevent anyone or anything from hearing what he was saying. The words were simple, but carried a strange weight. There are voices in the fog and lights that shouldn't be here. The storm was already brewing in the background, and the sound of the wind cut through the frequency like razors. The curious thing is that he didn't exactly seem scared, more intrigued, as if part of him wanted to understand what he was seeing, even though he knew it could be dangerous. As an investigator, I've heard many last-minute recordings, but this one had something different. It wasn't the account of a desperate man, but of someone who knew he was getting to the heart of a mystery. And honestly, that worried me even more. The official report said the communication was interrupted by line interference, but I don't believe in such convenient coincidences. Audio experts I consulted detected slight variations in frequency, almost like metallic whispers between Arthur's words. Some said it was just static. Others preferred not to comment. The truth is, I've heard noises like this before, in cases that combined crime and phenomena that science doesn't like to explain. This final transmission became a turning point for me. Not only because it confirmed that something unusual was happening, but because it opened a new trail of questions. What were those voices? Who or what was producing those lights in the middle of the sea? Questions that, as you will see, led me straight to the darkest moment of this investigation. That night, the sea seemed to have decided to swallow the world. Winds exceeding 60 mph, 100 kilometers, lashed the walls of the lighthouse, and the waves, as huge as buildings, crashed against the rocks with an almost animal-like roar. I'd weathered storms before, but this one had a different tone. It was as if the ocean itself was trying to hide something beneath its fury. Experienced fishermen said they'd never seen the sea act like that. Weather records confirm that atmospheric pressure plummeted hours before the disappearance. But what strikes me is that, in the diaries of the ancient guardians, storms like this always preceded reports of strange visitors. Coincidence? But in my experience, patterns like this are rarely the work of chance. It was as if each gust of wind was a harbinger, a warning to anyone not to dare approach. Imagining Arthur alone in there, with that fury all around him, gives me chills. The sound of the wind must have sounded like distant screams, and every creak of the structure could easily have been mistaken for footsteps. In isolated places, the weather isn't just a natural phenomenon. It becomes an active character, shaping the actions and decisions of those there. And that night, that character seemed to be working against him. But there's one detail that intrigues me more than the storm itself. Why, even in such extreme conditions, no distress lights were activated at the lighthouse. This leads me to believe that Arthur didn't see himself as a victim of circumstances, but rather as someone about to face something he already knew was coming. And that's where we arrive at the crime scene. When I finally managed to enter the lighthouse, The first thing I noticed was the heavy, almost solid silence, as if the air had stopped circulating. The door was locked from the inside, which made it clear that Arthur couldn't have simply gone for a walk. The clock on the wall read 3:17, frozen in time, as if to record the exact moment something happened. On the table, an uneaten meal still exuded the sweet smell of cold coffee. Walking through that space was like browsing through a silent diary. Every object seemed to be in its place, but there was a sense that nothing was quite right. The chairs slightly apart, an open book on the floor, a mug fallen next to the stairs. These were subtle details, but enough to raise the alarm in anyone who constantly investigates scenes that try to tell stories in silence. And believe me, silent scenes scream much louder than chaotic ones. The staircase leading to the top was marked with deep, scratch marks that rose upward until they disappeared into the darkness. I made a point of documenting each one. There were no signs of a struggle or forced entry, but the atmosphere, oh, that seemed to carry the traces of something that didn't belong there. It was as if the space had been traversed by an invisible visitor, leaving only subtle traces for those who knew how to look for them. As I jotted down my observations, one question kept echoing. If there was no sign of entry or exit, and if the door was locked from the inside, then where did Arthur go? And the answer to that question seemed to lie in the strange things I found soon after. Among Arthur's belongings, I found something that transformed the investigation from a simple disappearance into a case that touched on much darker territory. It was a diary, worn by salt and humidity, with yellowed pages and nearly illegible scribbles. The final entries seemed hastily written. "They've arrived, and I can't escape" appeared repeatedly, as if they were a desperate mantra. Most disturbing, however, were strange symbols drawn in the margins, geometric figures I'd seen in other cases, with unusual elements. Besides the diary, hidden in the back of a closet was a small cloth bag containing smooth, dark stones, all marked with the same symbol that appeared in the notebook. In one of Arthur's coat pockets, I found a crumpled note with just 3 words, "Look up." That sentence alone would have been enough to keep me awake for nights, but in the context of that lighthouse, it became even more disturbing. The camera, almost ceremonially stored, also caught my attention. Inside was a single film, partially developed, and the last image showed Arthur staring out the window, his expression a mix of fascination and terror. Behind him, in the dim light, there seemed to be a tall, narrow blur, difficult to identify but impossible to ignore. This detail made my stomach churn. These objects weren't simple puzzle pieces, they were fragments of a hidden narrative, one that Arthur seemed to know very well but didn't have the time or courage to fully explain. And strangely, each of them pointed to a single possibility: someone or something had been there with him before he disappeared, which led me to look for the first clues outside the lighthouse. The first thing that struck me, upon closer inspection of the lighthouse's structure, was the complete absence of classic signs of intrusion. There were no forced doors, broken windows, or forced locks. And this, paradoxically, made me even more uneasy, because when there's no physical sign of entry, there are 2 options: either the person willingly let the visitor in, or the visitor didn't need to use the door. Neither alternative is exactly comforting. I climbed the spiral staircase, again observing the deep scratches in the wood. The pattern didn't match animal claws or natural wear. They were long vertical lines, as if someone or something had climbed inside the tower. Measuring the distance between the marks, I realized whoever did it had hands or claws much larger than human hands. And if that weren't strange enough, the marks stopped abruptly before reaching the top, as if the something had vanished into thin air. On the ground near the base of the stairs, a thin layer of wet sand formed a half-moon trail. Strange, considering the door was closed and the floor was dry. The texture of this sand was different from that found on the island's beach. The grains were dark, almost black, and shone subtly in the flashlight. I collected samples because I've learned throughout my career that things too small to attract attention often hide the biggest answers. This set of clues didn't make sense within a conventional crime scenario. Everything about it screamed that we weren't dealing with a typical human invasion, and it was this feeling that led me to search for anyone who might have seen something that night. After all, even the most isolated place holds someone who swears they witnessed the impossible. Talking to fishermen is like opening a storybook the big city prefers to ignore. They have a peculiar way of recounting events. They don't pay much attention to dates, but describe smells, sounds, and sensations with almost poetic precision. That afternoon, I sat with three of them in a small bar near the pier. The kind of place where the wood is impregnated with salt and time seems to slow down. I ordered a strong coffee and let the stories unfold on their own. One of the men, with calloused hands and a gaze that had seen more storms than I could ever imagine, said he had seen, during the night of the storm, a tall, thin figure walking along the top of the lighthouse. The most disturbing detail, according to him, the figure seemed to sway from side to side, as if fighting the wind, but the wind at that height of the tower was so strong that it would have been impossible for anyone to remain standing. Yet, there it stood, motionless at times, as if observing something on the horizon. Another fisherman reported that, at the same time, a blue-green light seemed to flash in the sea, a few miles offshore. It wasn't a boat light, nor a flare. They know these patterns well. It was as if the sea was blinking back at the lighthouse, he said, and laughed nervously, trying to hide the shiver that ran down the back of his neck. Details like these always intrigue me, because they indicate that stories, though fantastic, carry a strange coherence. And then came the third report. A younger fisherman swore he heard a sound like a deep bell, echoing over the wind. But it wasn't coming from the lighthouse, he assured. It was coming from the sea, as if it were calling someone. These words left me with the feeling that Arthur's disappearance wasn't just an isolated event. Perhaps it was part of something larger, a long-standing pattern that the community itself had learned not to question. When the official investigation records reached me, I immediately realized how sparing they were with the details. The main report was only 7 pages long and read more like a checklist than a real investigation. The conclusion was almost lazy: voluntary disappearance or suicide, followed by a stamp and the signature of an officer who curiously retired a few days later. I've seen this kind of quick closure before. It almost always means someone wanted to avoid uncomfortable questions. As I searched the appendices, I found few photographs, all taken from distant angles, as if the photographer were afraid to get close. No detailed images of the diary, the marks on the ladder, or the camera found. Worse, the report didn't mention the strange symbols or the look-up note. It was as if certain parts of the scene had been conveniently ignored. Coincidence? Perhaps, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I contacted 2 investigators who participated in the investigation at the time. One refused to comment, citing orders from above, a term that always puts me on edge. The other, more willing, revealed that the case had involved more than one visit from consultants, from the capital, people in suits who didn't introduce themselves but spent hours alone inside the lighthouse. This kind of outside interference isn't common unless there's something very specific to be removed from the scene. In the end, the official investigation seemed more interested in closing the matter than resolving it. And this, to me, is almost a silent admission that there was much more to it than they were willing to admit. It was at this point that I realized I would need to explore hypotheses beyond traditional criminal explanations, and as absurd as it seemed, paranormal theories began to gain traction. Even with all the strange elements in the case, I needed to follow the logical path of criminal investigation. It was my duty to consider the possibility that Arthur had been involved in illegal activities. The lighthouse, due to its strategic location, would be perfect for smugglers. Few witnesses, a clear view of the sea, and easy signaling for vessels. It wouldn't be the first time a keeper had become an accomplice, willing or unwilling, in operations of this kind. One line of investigation suggested that Arthur might be helping to cover up nighttime unloading. But if that were the case, why disappear in the middle of a storm when no boat would dare approach? This inconsistency bothered me. Furthermore, his psychological profile didn't match that of someone motivated by easy money. He had no known debts, didn't lead a life of luxury, and had no suspicious ties, at least, none that I'd found so far. Another hypothesis was that he was hiding someone or something in the lighthouse. I've worked on such cases, and I can assure you that when someone disappears to protect another, they usually leave emotional trails. But Arthur left no goodbye notes, made no strange financial transactions, and didn't seem to be planning an escape. On the contrary, his routine in the previous days had been meticulously normal. except for the increasingly disturbing entries in his diary. These hypotheses, though plausible on paper, lost strength in the face of the body of physical evidence and the reports I'd been collecting. It was as if Arthur's disappearance had one foot in the world of crime, but the other in something completely beyond logic. And that's when I decided to explore the more controversial aspect, the possibility that the lighthouse was the scene of paranormal phenomena. I admit that, early in my career, I was somewhat reluctant to consider paranormal explanations. Logic and concrete evidence were my guiding principles. But over the years, I've learned that some cases simply don't fit into conventional investigative boxes, and Arthur Lighthouse seemed like one of those. Since its construction, there had been reports of apparitions, unexplained sounds, and lights at sea that appeared without apparent source. These weren't just folktales. Some accounts were documented in the journals of former keepers. I found, for example, a 1912 entry describing human figures of elongated proportions, walking on the rocks during storms, always looking toward the lighthouse. Another keeper, in 1936, wrote that during nights of dense fog, he would hear someone knocking at the door but never find anyone upon opening. The similarity between these accounts and events in Arthur's time was unsettling. It was as if history were repeating itself, with slight variations. When I cross-referenced this information with the symbols found in Arthur's journal, I realized they matched markings seen in other cases I've investigated, related to supposed energy portals near coastal areas. I'm not claiming these portals exist, but it's curious how certain patterns repeat themselves in locations thousands of miles apart. At the very least, this warranted further investigation. Still, diving into this line of investigation came at a price. It meant dealing with skepticism, the pressure of maintaining credibility, and above all, the risk of looking into something perhaps better left unexplored. But I knew that to find Arthur, or at least discover what happened to him, I would need to follow this path, even if it led me to confront fears I'd always preferred to keep locked away. Prolonged isolation is a silent enemy. It doesn't knock on the door or leave obvious traces, but it infiltrates the mind until it erodes one's perception of reality. Analyzing Arthur's routine, I realized he would go weeks without direct human contact, except for brief radio communications. This kind of solitude can distort time, alter sleep patterns, and even trigger auditory and visual hallucinations, fertile ground for the mind to create monsters or perhaps perceive things others wouldn't. His diary reflected clear signs of growing anxiety. In the early entries, the handwriting was firm and orderly. In the later pages, the letters were irregular, slanted, almost illegible. This to me indicated that Arthur was under intense mental pressure. It wasn't just fear, but a psychological exhaustion that can lead someone to drastic decisions. However, there was one intriguing detail. He never wrote about wanting to leave. On the contrary, he seemed determined to stay. I spoke with a psychologist who specializes in professionals who work in extreme environments, such as explorers and military personnel. He explained that, in some cases, isolation doesn't distance a person from their role. On the contrary, it creates an almost obsessive bond with the place. This made me wonder if Arthur might have developed a symbiotic relationship with the lighthouse, as if it were part of his very identity. What if, sensing something threatening that space, he was willing to sacrifice everything to protect it? This psychological aspect added a complex layer to the investigation. It wasn't just about what happened to Arthur, but about what he was willing to face or accept before disappearing, and this insight would become even more relevant when I discovered the controversies surrounding the lighthouse and the authorities responsible for its care. Searching through public records, I found a series of old complaints about working conditions at the lighthouse. Keepers reported constant leaks, faulty equipment, and long periods without supplies. Most of these complaints never materialized, drowned out by optimistic reports sent to maritime authorities. This, in itself, was serious. But there was a darker detail. 3 previous keepers had died or disappeared, and all of these cases were classified as unavoidable accidents. Interviewing former employees revealed a culture of almost military silence. Many avoided talking about certain nights, especially stormy ones. One told me, with a suspicious look, that he had received direct orders to not record anything out of the ordinary in his official diary. Of course, he kept a private notebook, but most of these notes were lost after a mysterious fire destroyed his home years ago. Coincidence? Hard to believe. There were also rumors that the lighthouse was being used for unofficial experiments involving long-distance communication and unusual light signals. These stories were dismissed as folklore by some, but I've since learned that where there's smoke, there's often fire, especially when the smoke comes from an institution that insists there's nothing to see. This backdrop of neglect and secrecy made Arthur's disappearance not just a personal tragedy, but part of a history of strange and poorly explained events. And this history would gain a new chapter 3 months later when something unexpected was found and rekindled all the questions. 3 months after Arthur's disappearance, when the case was beginning to fade, a fisherman found a stranded boat in a secluded cove about 5 miles from the lighthouse. The hull was partially covered in seaweed and crustaceans, as if it had been adrift for a long time. Inside, there was only a life jacket marked with the lighthouse's coat of arms and a broken oar. There were no signs of a struggle, blood, or any of Arthur's personal belongings. What intrigued me most was the location of the find. The ocean currents in that area would have been unlikely to bring a boat from the lighthouse there unless it had been guided by someone or something. I consulted navigation experts, and they all agreed for the boat to reach that cove, it would have needed to follow an unusual route, avoiding areas of strong currents. In other words, it didn't seem like a coincidence. Some marks on the boat's edge caught my attention. Long, shallow, parallel scratches, unlike those made by ropes or nets. The texture resembled the marks on the lighthouse ladder, which wasn't exactly comforting. I made a point of photographing and saving the record, knowing that details like these can become key pieces later on. This discovery quietly reopened the investigation, as the case had officially been closed. For me, it was proof that there were more physical elements connecting Arthur's disappearance to external factors. And it was in this context that another clue emerged, something visual, coming directly from inside the lighthouse, that would make me rethink everything I believed about that night. The camera I found at the lighthouse seemed to have been stored with almost ritualistic care. The leather case was worn but still sturdy, and the metal clasp bore the marks of frequent use. Inside was a roll of partially developed film. I sent the material to a specialized lab, and when I received the photos, well, it was one of those moments when your breath catches and the silence becomes almost unbearable. The last image showed Arthur standing by the lighthouse window, staring out at something. The angle of the light revealed every line of tension on his face, a mix of fascination and terror, as if he were facing something only he could see. But that wasn't all. In the corner of the image, a dark, vertical blur loomed, too tall to be an ordinary person, too thin to be a streetlight or the shadow of a structure. It didn't make sense. I analyzed the photo with imaging experts, and they all came to the same conclusion. It wasn't a film defect or a reflection. The blur had a defined shape, but without sharp edges, as if it were something solid and, at the same time, partially outside the reality of the scene. Some tried to suggest it could be a long exposure effect, but that explanation didn't fit the object's position and proportions. That photo changed the tone of my investigation. It didn't definitively prove anything, but it also left no room for easy explanations. More than that, it reinforced a frightening connection to old cases involving disappearances in lighthouses during storms. It was then that I discovered that Arthur wasn't the first to vanish from that tower, and that there was a pattern so dark it was impossible to ignore. As I delved deeper into the historical archives, I discovered that Arthur's disappearance was not an isolated case. 2 other keepers, in different years, also vanished without a trace. The first was in 1924. Thomas Bell, a robust and experienced man, disappeared during a windy night, leaving behind only his boots near the lighthouse door. The second, in 1957, was James Holloway, found dead miles away, floating in the sea with a serene expression, as if he had fallen asleep. Most disturbing was that, in each case, there had been violent storms on the night of the disappearance. Furthermore, the records of the 2 previous guardians also mentioned strange sounds and lights coming from the sea, descriptions nearly identical to those Arthur wrote in his journal. This repetition of elements made me realize we weren't dealing with coincidences, but a pattern rooted in the location itself. I spoke with descendants of these victims' families, and all, without exception, reported that the investigations were too hasty and yielded unconvincing conclusions. In some cases, personal belongings mysteriously disappeared from official archives. One of Holloway's grandsons, showed me a letter written by his grandfather a few days before his death, in which he said, "If the sea calls, don't answer." That made a deep impression on me. These historical connections gave Arthur's case even greater weight. It wasn't just about a missing man, but about a cycle that seemed to repeat itself over decades. And like every cycle, it left traces, including in old audio recordings that preserved more than just the sounds of a storm. The lighthouse's old audio files were stored in a rusty metal box, forgotten, in the captaincy's hold. The tapes, dusty and fragile, creaked when rewound, as if protesting the idea of reliving what had been recorded there. Listening to the first few, I realized that beyond the obvious sounds of wind and waves, there was something else, something that seemed to move between the frequencies, almost hidden. In at least 3 recordings, I detected a pattern of noises that, in isolation, resembled whispered voices. It wasn't English, nor any language I recognized. A phonetics expert I consulted ventured to say it sounded like an archaic language, with a cadenced intonation, like a chant, the most disturbing detail. These whispers always appeared in the minutes before thunderstorms. On one of the tapes, dated 1957, the year James Holloway disappeared, I heard a low metallic sound, similar to a distant bell, followed by a sequence of 3 rhythmic beats. When I compared it with recordings made during Arthur's time, I realized the same sound pattern was present. The connection was impossible to ignore. These discoveries shifted my focus. Whatever was happening there wasn't limited to a single event or a specific generation. It was as if the lighthouse were an antenna, picking up or attracting something coming from far away. And this idea was only reinforced when I received an anonymous letter that seemed to have in-depth knowledge of what I was about to discover. The letter arrived without a return address, in a crumpled manila envelope, slipped under my office door. The slightly yellowed paper bore only one handwritten sentence: "The lighthouse doesn't take people, it returns what the sea has lost." There was no signature, no obvious clue as to who might have sent it, but those words echoed in my mind like a riddle that somehow made sense amidst the chaos of the investigation. I spent days pondering its meaning. What if Arthur hadn't been taken against his will? What if he had gone to meet something or someone that the sea had returned to him? This perspective completely changed the angle of the investigation, transforming victim and protagonist into one and the same figure. The concept of returning carried an almost supernatural weight, as if the island were merely a transit point between 2 worlds. Began to re-examine every detail in light of this new insight. The position of the found boat, the blur in the photograph, the scratches on the ladder, the lights in the sea, everything seemed part of a script that didn't follow human logic. And the more I analyzed, the more I realized that perhaps I was trying to decipher something that wasn't meant to be understood, at least, not entirely. This turn of events didn't answer all my questions, in fact. It created even more, but it also prepared me for the final step, returning to the lighthouse on a stormy night to see for myself what so many keepers over the decades seemed to have found. And that's when the current status of the place showed that the case was somehow still alive. Today, the lighthouse is officially abandoned. No keeper, no regular maintenance, just a skeleton of stone and metal withstanding the elements. But for the residents of the nearby village, it has never ceased to fulfill its purpose. On foggy nights, they swear they see the light turn on by itself, rotating slowly, as if an invisible operator were still there. I myself have recently heard reports of a lone figure walking on top, motionless, for long minutes, before disappearing without a trace. On my last visits to the island, I noticed that the structure remains locked, and yet fresh marks on the wooden staircase indicate that someone or something has been moving around. The accumulated dust reveals thin, almost imperceptible footprints that begin suddenly and disappear halfway down the path. None of them lead to the exit door. It's as if they appeared out of nowhere and vanished into thin air. Some fishermen, the same ones who told me about that night, claim that the lights in the sea continue to appear, always with the same blue-green hue. And the deep, bell-like sound can still be heard when the wind blows from the south. Interestingly, these occurrences seem to occur around the same time of year that Arthur disappeared. If you ask me today what really happened to him, I don't have a single answer. Perhaps the lighthouse holds secrets that will never be explained. Or perhaps it's just a stage where reality and legend blend until they become indistinguishable. What I do know is that as long as this light continues to burn on its own, Arthur Doyle's story will never truly be over. So, after everything you've heard, what do you think really happened to Arthur Doyle? Was he the victim of a carefully concealed crime, or did he answer a call from somewhere we can't even explain? That's the beauty and the terror of cases like this. They remind us that the world still holds mysteries beyond our certainties. The big question is, what would you do if you were in his shoes? Would you stay, even knowing the risk, to protect something you consider your duty? Or would you run away without looking back? These decisions, deep down, are the same ones we make in real life. Even if the beacons we face aren't made of stone, but of difficult situations and choices. And if there's one thing I've learned from this investigation, it's that ignoring signs, whether strange lights at sea or premonitions, almost always leads us to places we didn't choose. So pay attention to the storms approaching in your life, and don't underestimate the power of silence. It can say more than 1,000 words. Now tell me in the comments, do you believe Arthur's case has a logical explanation, or are we facing something much more than that? I want to hear your theory, and of course, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to continue following investigations like this, because believe me, I still have many more stories you won't find anywhere else.